Thank you. Thanks, Onora. And can I follow others in saying many thanks to the organisers for this invitation, which is an honour. I have to say, extremely intimidated by the idea of having to get slides in 5 days in advance. As someone who traditionally, in fact, I'm still writing what I was going to say as I was listening to the other three excellent presentations. So I've over-slided, if there is such a word. So my apologies in advance, because I didn't have a clue what I was going to say. Can I also say, I'm going to say a little bit, referencing at the end to Onora's work, but I do want to pay tribute right at the beginning. I sort of reached back into my classical education of many years ago, and I remember reading about Plato's philosopher king and the utopian city of Callipolis, and I think here we have a philosopher baroness in the slightly less utopian environment of Westminster and Parliament. But Onora's is a wonderful embodiment of someone who will get stuck in on some of the knottier policy issues around some big philosophical issues. And I've obviously read her work and her books, but actually her contributions in the House of Lords, our second chamber on these issues, have been immense and invaluable, and have been actually very important in pushing this issue forward. I'm conscious that the concept of ethics for communication is pretty vast, so I'm going to be confining myself more specifically to the ethics of journalism, even more narrowly to the ethics of professional journalism, which in itself is a problematic term, which I'm going to address in a minute. I want to stress that I've posed this question within the context not only of an underlying philosophical approach to journalism, but also within the culturally specific context of the UK, where questions about ethical conduct are hotly contested. The Brexit vote, I think, has crystallised an identity issue that I believe has festered for some time in Britain amongst the older generations, in which the country has never really been able to decide whether it is more comfortable looking east or looking west in terms of its cultural values, its economic alliances, its social networks, and its political aspirations. While Nigel Farage and his allies still harbour their fantasy image of a United Kingdom anchored somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, where they can eat cucumber sandwiches, drink warm beer, watch cricket on village greens, and listen to Donald Trump, most Britons have a rather more nuanced and patchwork approach in terms of their cultural values. In journalism, this schizophrenia has traditionally been represented by a public service broadcasting tradition, bequeathed to and well established now throughout Western Europe, and a print journalism tradition which owes more to the yellow press of early 20th century America and Rupert Murdoch's amoral standards honed in Australia. Within the British context, I want to look at who defines professional ethics. Now, as I said, the notion of professionalism is itself problematic. There is still considerable support for the conviction that social and online media have converted all of us into potential journalists. The American academic Robert McChesney, in his book Digital Disconnect, divides the commentariat into digital celebrants and digital skeptics. The celebrants, he says, are swept along by an internet-driven tide of optimism. This is how James Curran characterizes that optimism in his book, Misunderstanding the Internet. He says, the internet would inaugurate a new era of cultural democracy in which the old media leviathans would decay and die. It would rejuvenate democracy, shrink the universe, promote dialogue between nations, and foster global understanding. The celebrant thinking is perhaps best encapsulated by Clay Shirky, but many other digital gurus argue fiercely that the online world has democratized communications through collaboration, through publicness, and through knowledge sharing. Communicative power has fragmented to the masses, and journalism has been wrenched from so-called professionals and devolved to the streets. And now any bystander with a smartphone and a blog can become an instant journalist, can record events, relay facts, or vent opinions. The very concept of the professional newsroom is a dinosaur analog construct. Now, ranged against these resolute romantics are the digital skeptics, the party poopers of journalism futurology. The skeptics are convinced that the internet is just as capable of promoting ignorance as knowledge, that it promotes a filter bubble of received wisdoms as citizens choose their own comfort zones rather than challenging or dissonant opinions. I refer to Laura's anecdote of the taxi driver. That's an enemy of new discovery, actually fosters loneliness, isolation, and alienation. In journalistic terms, they say, there is no substitute for the professionalism of those who bear witness and who hold power to account according to a set of professional and ethical norms. Now, I confess to always having been a bit of a party pooper and a fully paid up member of the Skeptics Party. Perhaps now more than ever, though, we need established norms of professionalism. In an age where several 100,000 American voters during their presidential election read that the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump and that Obama was being indicted by the FBI for wiretapping Trump Towers, we need to know whether these stories are being constructed in a Macedonian living room or have some semblance of truth. Closer to home, we need to know how quickly, when there is news of an explosion, whether it's a bomb or whether, as some reports suggested in the immediate aftermath of the Manchester atrocity, whether it was an exploding generator. When pictures start circulating of those who've been caught in the blast, we need to know whether these are real people rather than photos randomly taken from social media pages. That sort of verification cannot be done by informal bystanders with iPhones. The same is true of referendums and elections. When claims are being made about the levels and impact of immigration, for example, we need reliable sources to sort out the fact from the sensationalism, the propaganda, and the deliberate scaremongering, not just because the accuracy of information underpins the legitimacy of democratic decision-making, but because there are real-life consequences of unqualified misinformation. Just as the Holocaust was built on the lie machines of 1930s Nazi propaganda, so intolerance of refugees is propagated by inaccurate information about public services unable to take the strain of refugee insurgents, and violence against Muslims is fostered by misinformation, sometimes deliberate, about every mosque becoming a haven for extremist radicalization. Recent history, as well as, in my view, common sense, therefore dictates that the case for professional journalism is unanswerable. So, in that case, how do we characterize both the normative roles and the values and ethics by which it should be underpinned? Some of this, of course, has been covered implicitly and explicitly in the previous sessions, but very roughly, crudely, I would say there are four ideal type normative roles which journalism plays in democratic societies. First, journalism as the conveyor of relevant, accurate, and undistorted information, an easily accessible means of giving citizens the tools with which to come to an informed view of the world. The second is to provide access to collective rational debate in which citizens can deliberate and develop their own arguments, whether it be letters, columns in the press, phone-in programs, chat rooms on the internet, or online blogs. All media have a potentially ideal role as a neutral public space to assist rational debate and therefore collective opinion formation. This role, of course, has its roots in the Habermasian ideal of the public sphere. The third is the watchdog role, holding government, elected representatives to account, investigating allegations of wrongdoing, corruption, lies, digging up the dirt that powerful interests may be trying to conceal, and finally, the model of media as tribunes of the people. Mass audience publications, programs or online sites can seek to synthesize the public's collective view and then campaign as they see it or as they claim on the public's behalf. Now, professional journalism in pursuit of those norms is traditionally circumscribed by codes of editorial practice which define the boundaries of ethical conduct. In the UK, Ofcom lays down rules for broadcasters, licensed broadcasters, including, as of April this year, the BBC. The press, including its online platforms, has historically developed its own editorial codes. The most recent incarnation, established and controlled by the major national publishers, of course, is the so-called Independent Press Standards Organisation, of which more in a moment. And of course, Jonathan's Impress has been formally recognised both as independent and effective. In addition, the National Union of Journalists has its own ethical code of conduct involving 12 principles to which members are expected to adhere. These codes, all in various degrees of detail, lay down appropriate codes for publishers and journalists. Now, I don't want to enumerate them here in detail, but they provide guidance for ethical behaviour on issues such as accuracy, privacy and intrusion into grief, including use of photography, harassment and persistent pursuit of interviewees, dealing with children, reporting of suicide, the use of subterfuge, hidden filming and entrapment, the acquisition and use of private information, including information taken from social media sites, all underpinned by exceptions through public interest justifications. Now, I'm going to return in a minute to that central issue of the definition of the public interest, because it lies at the heart of debates, I think, about ethics and journalistic professionalism. But I first want to draw attention to the contrast in regulatory structures between broadcast and print media in the UK in ensuring implementation of these largely consensual editorial ethical codes. Broadcasters are obliged, as part of their license, to abide by the codes which are laid down by Ofcom. Ofcom has the power to order on-screen corrections for code breaches, to determine the timing and wording of such corrections, to levy fines for serious breaches, and ultimately, for serious and persistent breaches, to revoke the license to broadcast. The result has been independent journalism over several decades of the highest standard, in pursuit of all the normative roles which I've just outlined: investigations, truth-telling, a trusted forum for opinion sharing, and robust interrogation which holds power to account, have all been a regular feature of Britain's broadcast journalism. So what about the print media? Some of its journalism is brilliant, much of it isn't. I don't intend to rehearse the catalogue of abuse and wrongdoing that emerged during the Leveson inquiry, which Jonathan alluded to 5 years ago, but I want to emphasise a central issue which is often misunderstood. That inquiry was not just centred on criminal phone hacking, but on the far more wide-ranging culture, practice and ethics of the press. And what we heard was a litany of failure which went way beyond breaches of the criminal law. We heard about intrusions into private grief, bullying and intimidation, intrusions into privacy, surveillance of MPs and the lawyers of victims by newspapers, theft of confidential data, people's private medical, financial, police and driving records were stolen, data mining described as being on an industrial scale by an official investigation by the Information Commissioner, and gratuitous inaccuracies to fit the story of those that the newspapers believed were guilty. Some of this evidence was frankly beyond belief, shocking and repeated revelations of malicious distortion, vindictive bullying, and gross intrusions, which defied any kind of editorial code. It amounted to a flagrant and systematic disregard for the editor's code, regularly flouted by newspapers and with impunity. Now, I wanted to highlight in particular the issue of privacy as a means of trying to calibrate more accurately the role of ethics in journalistic decision-making. And I first want to illustrate the editorial mindset with a notorious example from last year, which became known as the celebrity threesome case. The background was this. In January 2016, The Sun on Sunday wanted to publish an article about an extramarital affair involving a well-known entertainer who it was alleged had a three-way sexual encounter with 2 other individuals 6 years earlier. One of those individuals, which happens quite often, had come to the paper with the story and was prepared to give intimate details in return for a large payment. The celebrity who was implicated was married, and he and his partner had young children. He was known in court only as PJS, not the initials for his real name, to retain his anonymity. One of the gaudier details of this so-called 3-in-a-bed scenario was that it involved bathing in olive oil, a little detail which will become clear in terms of why it's relevant in a moment. PJS was informed of this impending story, applied for an injunction to prevent publication, was refused by the Court of First Instance, but was then granted an injunction by the Court of Appeal. The newspaper, in opposing the injunction, argued vehemently that PJS had put many details of his marriage into the public domain and that there was a public interest in publishing the details of his sexual exploits with others. The paper appealed to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. Last May, the Supreme Court heard the case and decided by, there were 5 Supreme Court judges, decided by 4 votes to 1 to uphold the injunction, and the names of the protagonists remain unpublished by the press to this day. The press reaction to that verdict was furious, if predictable, outrage. The Daily Mail headline when the Court of Appeal overturned the initial injunction was "Why the Law is an Ass." And when the Supreme Court decision came out, this was the Sun's verdict, and hence the little detail about the bath of olive oil. So here were their justifications. According to the Mail, it is your right to know. The Court of Appeal ruling banning British press from naming cheating married celebrity is draconian and unfair to the public. These are my italics, by the way. And the Sun. It is palpably absurd to keep our readers from seeing information available to billions online. Judges should rule on the law, not impose their snooty prejudices about tabloid stories they find prurient. It's not their call to decide what's in the public interest or whether that differs from what the public is interested in. So this was the rationalization by editors based on arguments around free speech and transparency in the public interest. In other words, their position is vindicated by reference to the public's appetite for those kinds of stories. It is a familiar populist libertarian argument that we have always liked: gossip, scandal, crime stories. It was famously immortalized by Ronald Reagan's chairman of the Federal Communications Committee, Mark Fowler, with the words, "The public's interest defines the public interest." And this, they said, is why the News of the World was the second biggest selling newspaper in Europe before its closure. In a nutshell, say the editors, our ethics of journalism reflects the public's ethics of journalism. Now, 5 years ago, for the British Journalism Review, where I'm on the editorial board, I tested that proposition with some empirical research into public attitudes, with some interesting results. So I want to spend a few minutes going through the questions that were asked and the responses from the general public. This was following standard opinion polling techniques, asking a representative sample of the population. This was the question that we asked them. Here are a number of possible newspaper stories. Please tell me for each story whether the paper should or should not publish the story. And here were the responses that respondents were offered. The story is definitely in the public interest and should be published. Not necessarily in the public interest, but should nevertheless be published. The story is a private matter and should not be published, and don't know. So there are essentially 2 options for saying the story should be published, 1 for not being published. Those 8 stories were presented in random order, and I'm going to give you the responses in order of whether they supported publication or not. So this was the first story. Foods sold by a major supermarket have been contaminated with bacteria. So, how did people respond to that? Well, actually fairly predictably. A huge proportion said this was in the public interest and should certainly be published. Second story. A High Court judge has large investments in foreign companies linked to the illegal drugs trade. And again, a very large majority in favour of publication. Third story, a school teacher has been passing on exam questions to students to help their GCSE grades. These are the exams that we take at 16. Slightly less, but still a large majority in favour of publication. Fourth story, a company testing medicines is suspected of cruelty towards animals. And of course, we are very keen on our animals in the UK, so this was very much regarded as being in the public interest. But now it gets interesting. So this was the fifth story. A well-known England footballer who is married with young children is having an affair. The very kind of story that the newspapers regard as absolutely their right to publish in the public interest. And I kind of assumed that maybe there would be a sort of 50-50 split, possibly, certainly in terms of the two responses combined, a majority in favour of publication. That was the response. A clear majority actually regarding this as that it shouldn't be published, even if it was not necessarily in the public interest. The sixth story, the leading politician's daughter is found drunk in public. Again, the kind of story which the British press would regard as slap bang in the middle of a public interest justification, disagreed by general members of the public. Seventh story, a leading member of a pop group has had cosmetic surgery to change the shape of her face, the kind of story that you tend to get on the back of celebrity programs. Again, the majority, 2/3 against publication. And finally, a contestant on Britain's Got Talent who's reached the final once tried to commit suicide. And here you have a very large majority against publication. So, what do we conclude? For most people in the UK, the journalistic imperative of telling truth to power does not entail exposing the details of infidelity or revealing the kinds of salacious material which are a routine element of kiss and tell stories. So the editorial justifications that we've heard from the press are wrong, nor are they supported by grassroots journalists, and this is important. At the Leveson inquiry, the National Union of Journalists General Secretary quoted anonymous journalists who said they were being forced to follow editorial directions. They weren't prepared to give their names for fear of reprisals. Bullying has been endemic in some of these newsrooms. So why is there such a disconnect between ethical values espoused by the public and journalists and those dictated by some newsrooms? And here I think we have to look at the historical and economic structural factors going back some time. First of all, we have a national newspaper tradition in the UK, which goes back 150 years, a small geographical area where distribution lines are relatively easy from a centralised printing process, often based in London. This compares to most European countries whose traditions are much more regionally based. Ferocious competition at this national level between still 9 hard copy print titles, 10 if you include online, unique possibly in the world with the exception of Japan, a tabloid tradition going back decades which has often operated at the margins of journalistic ethics, foot-in-the-door techniques, apologetic in terms of the way in which they approach their subjects, and some of the biographies of former Fleet Street editors are pretty graphic in some of the tales that they tell. The distinguished British playwright Tom Stoppard, a fierce free speech advocate, distinguished between what he called St. George journalism and jackal journalism. This is what he said. The national press which emerged from the Leveson inquiry presented a split personality, part St. George, part jackal, which is not actually journalism, but a delinquency which happened to be practiced by journalists. I think this split personality is best diagnosed in classical sociological terms as a struggle between structure and agency. The inculcation of ethical and professional values which reflect universal values on the one hand versus a newsroom culture and a top-down editorial imperatives dictated by publishers on the other. What we've struggled to find in the UK is a structural solution founded on those ethical values which are naturally embraced by the public and by most journalists. And that is what the Leveson proposals in 2012 were designed to achieve. Now, I'm not going to go into any detail about those proposals, but the bottom criteria of this slide, I think, is the encapsulation of the proposed system: effective, independent, sustainable, and not subject to the whims of commercial and proprietorial imperatives. Our broadcasting environment provides empirical evidence that journalistic freedom is not impaired by an effective regulator with teeth, but this structural solution for the press was founded also on a philosophical argument most eloquently advanced by Onora in her 2002 Wreath Lectures, when she distinguished between individual free speech and corporate free speech. Prophetically, and remember this was 15 years ago when Onora was writing this, she warned that we were perilously close to a world in which media conglomerates act as if they too had unrestricted rights of free expression. Onora then elaborated on this theme in a lecture in November 2011 when she distinguished between individual self-expression and the speech of powerful organizations. The communication of the powerful can shape and influence, improve and damage others' lives. And in democracies, we've long since taken steps to regulate the communication of the most powerful organizations. Crucially, she drew a distinction between regulating media content, which was not acceptable, and regulating media process, which was both acceptable and desirable as a means of ensuring transparency for audiences as well as accountability of the powerful. Regulating the process by which fairness, accuracy, respect for privacy, redress for journalistic malpractice are properly implemented by the press need entail no constraint on newspapers or publishers' freedom to publish. It's become horribly apparent over the last 20 years that the ethical values determined through culture, history, and tradition by publishers are out of kilter with the rest, but it is their definition, their corporate vision, which still dictates British print journalism culture. And that is why, when their vision is threatened by a structural solution designed to embrace a consensual approach to ethical journalism, this is the kind of campaign which Britain's press elite chooses to launch. So I will conclude now. Onora, with I think another tribute to Onora, if you'll forgive me, who has been a stalwart and, in my view, inspirational leader of change. I have to say that, unfortunately, so far, it is the antediluvians and the dinosaurs of the British press who still hold the floor. I must finish with one anecdote, also taken from Tom Stoppard, because Onora opened her Reuters lecture that I talked about with a famous quote from Stoppard, which he's quoted many times after the phone hacking scandal, from his play called Night and Day, where one of the characters says, "I'm with you on the free press, it's the newspapers I can't stand." For today's purposes, I think there's a rather better line later in the same play. A certain President Magiba of the fictional African Republic Kambawi is interrogating a veteran British tabloid reporter, a man called Dick Wagner, who's come to report on his country. And he asked Wagner, "Do you know what I mean by a relatively free press, Mr. Wagner?" "Not exactly, no, sir," says Wagner. "I mean," says the president, "a free press which is edited by one of my relatives." Now, we don't have many publications in Britain which are edited by the relatives of proprietors, but they're all appointed by proprietors, or editors are appointed by proprietors who have very clear ideas, not just about the editorial direction of their publications, but also their operating culture. And it was pretty clear, not just before Leveson, but even since, that newsroom cultures in many of those organizations pay scant attention to the norms of appropriate journalistic ethics that are both implicit and explicit in the codes of conduct which they themselves have drawn up and purport to follow. For that to change will require a structural solution along the lines of Leveson, firmly cemented by an approach to journalism rooted in public and journalist approach to ethics rather than editors and proprietors. Thank you.